Royal guards searched Camilla's closet, then discovered the late Queen's coronation robe, hidden inside a true story. You can live in a place for years, open the same doors every morning, walk the same hallways, sit in the same chairs, and never know what is tucked away in the far corner of a wardrobe, wrapped in cloth, sitting in the dark, waiting. Most of the time, when those secrets are finally found, they are small things: a bundle of old letters, a photograph of someone nobody recognizes anymore, a piece of jewelry that someone tucked away and then forgot, or perhaps decided not to forget but never quite found the right moment to explain. But sometimes, what is found is not small at all. Sometimes what is found changes the way you understand everything that came before it. Sometimes the thing sitting quietly in the dark at the back of a closet turns out to be the most significant object in the building, and finding it opens a door into someone's private world in a way that no official record and no public appearance ever could. This story begins in the autumn of 2022, inside one of the most famous residential buildings in London. It begins with a routine job, a professional team, a cedar-lined wardrobe, and a discovery that nobody in that building was prepared for. And it ends somewhere quite different, somewhere much more personal and much more human than a routine inventory of a royal residence has any right to end. It ends with one woman's final private message to another, a message written by hand, delivered through the most unexpected of circumstances, hidden inside a wardrobe alongside a piece of cloth that had witnessed the most significant moment in modern British history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Let us go back to where everything starts, because this is the kind of story that only makes sense when you understand the full picture. And the full picture goes back a very long way. It goes back further, in fact, than most people would think to look when they first hear the headline about guards and closets and a robe being found somewhere unexpected. Because the robe itself has a history that is worth knowing before you can understand why its discovery meant what it meant. And the two women at the center of this story have a history that is worth knowing before you can understand what was really being communicated when that robe was left where it was left. In the summer of 1953, the world was a different place. The Second World War had ended less than a decade before. Europe was still rebuilding. Britain was a country that had survived something enormous and was now doing what countries do after enormous things, getting on with it. There was rationing still in some places. There were bombed-out lots in London where new buildings were slowly going up. There was a particular kind of determined, no-nonsense cheerfulness in the air, the sort of cheerfulness that people put on when life has been genuinely hard and they have decided to come through it anyway. Into this world, on the morning of June 2, 1953, there came a ceremony. Westminster Abbey, which is one of the oldest and most significant churches in Britain, had been dressed for the occasion in a way it had not been dressed for centuries. There were flowers everywhere. There were flags. The wooden seats arranged for 8,000 guests had been carefully upholstered, which was not normally how they looked. Outside on the streets of London, the crowds had been gathering since the previous evening. Some people had slept on the pavement in the rain, wrapped in whatever they had, just so they could be there, just so they could see it happen as the procession passed. All along the route from Buckingham Palace to Westminster Abbey, there were people standing 3 and 4 and 5 deep, pressed against barriers, holding small paper flags, waiting. And the thing they were waiting for was this. A 27-year-old woman was going to become the Queen of Great Britain and the Commonwealth. Her name was Elizabeth Alexandra Mary Windsor, and she had already been the monarch, technically, since her father King George VI had died in February 1952. But the coronation, the actual ceremony, the ancient ritual of anointing and crowning that makes it official and makes it real in the eyes of history, that had been scheduled for this day. And this day had arrived. Inside the Abbey, the atmosphere was unlike anything that most of those 8,000 people had ever experienced and would ever experience again. There was music, of course, but it was not playing in the casual way that music plays in the background of things. It was filling the space, filling the stone arches and the high windows, and the centuries of accumulated silence, filling the air with something that made people feel the weight of where they were and what they were watching. There were clergy in robes, There were officials carrying objects of extraordinary historical significance. There were members of the peerage in their own ceremonial dress, and members of the military in their uniforms, and heads of state from around the world, all gathered in this one building on this one morning. And at the center of it all, walking slowly, and with the particular composure of someone who has prepared for a long time and who has decided not to be afraid, was Elizabeth. The ceremony lasted nearly 3 hours. There was a moment of anointing, which was so private and so sacred that the cameras, which were filming everything else, were instructed not to film it. A canopy was held over the young queen by 4 Knights of the Garter, as the Archbishop of Canterbury anointed her with holy oil on her hands and her chest and her head. She sat very still. She was alone under that canopy, in a way that must have felt profound, surrounded by 8,000 people and yet entirely alone with the weight of what was happening to her. Think about what that actually was for a moment. A young woman, 27 years old, sitting in one of the oldest churches in Britain, under a canopy, while a man in robes poured oil over her skin. The oil itself was a mixture that had been used in British coronations for centuries, scented with orange, roses, cinnamon, and musk. It was old. It connected her in a physical way to every monarch who had been anointed before her, going back to the medieval period. When the oil touched her hands, she was being joined to a chain of people stretching back hundreds and hundreds of years. That is a serious thing to sit with in the middle of a church, with 8,000 people waiting on the other side of a canopy for you to emerge as their queen. Those who saw her face when the canopy was removed described her as composed. This was the word everyone used. Not serene, not joyful, not frightened. Composed. The face of someone who has decided exactly what they are going to be in this moment and has fully committed to that decision. She had come to be queen. She was going to be queen. She was not going to waver. Then came the dressing. Before the crown was placed on her head, Queen Elizabeth was dressed in the garments of her coronation. First, there was a simple white linen dress, called the Colobium Sindonis, which was part of the ancient ritual of anointing. Then came the supertunica, a long coat of gold silk. Then the imperial mantle, also in gold. And finally, before everything else was laid upon her, before the orb and the scepter and the ring and the crown, she was wrapped in something that the whole world would see and would remember for the rest of the century. The coronation robe. It was made of velvet, deep imperial purple, the color that has been associated with royalty for thousands of years, going back to a time when purple dye was so rare and so expensive that only the most powerful people in the world could afford to wear it. The velvet was thick and heavy, not the kind of fabric you drape carelessly, but the kind that falls in serious, deliberate folds, that moves the way stone buildings move, with a sense of permanence. Along every edge, the robe was trimmed with ermine. Real ermine, white fur from the stoat in its winter coat, pale and almost luminous, with the small dark markings that distinguish it from ordinary white fur and that have been used to trim the robes of British royalty since medieval times. The embroidery was what made it extraordinary. Running along the edges and across the surfaces were intricate patterns of gold thread, worked by hand by skilled craftspeople who had spent weeks or months on this single garment. The thread caught the light differently at different angles, so that as the robe moved, it seemed almost to be alive, shifting between a deep warm gold and something brighter, something that held the candlelight of the abbey and threw it back into the room. When Elizabeth II stood to receive her crown, when she rose from the coronation chair, and the Archbishop of Canterbury lifted the crown of St. Edward and placed it on her head, and when the assembled guests in the abbey rose as one and shouted, "God save the Queen," and the guns fired outside in salute, and the abbey bells began to ring, she was wearing that robe. Every camera in the building captured it. Every newsreel crew filming the event got it on their footage. Every newspaper in the world used photographs of it on their front pages the next morning. It was broadcast on television, in the first time a British coronation had ever been televised, and people across the country who had bought or borrowed or crowded around a television set for the occasion saw it and felt something stir in their chests that they could not quite name. People who were alive in 1953 and who watched the coronation have described the experience in similar terms, decades later, when asked about it. They say it was the sense that something real was happening, something that connected them to something larger than themselves. A woman being crowned in an ancient church while the country watched was, on one level, a ceremony. On another level, it was a statement. This is what we are. This is where we come from. This is what we choose to continue. The robe, and the woman inside it, were the physical form of that statement. That robe, that woman, that moment. It became one of the defining images of the 20th century. And then, when the ceremony was over, and the procession was done, and the crowds had gone home, and the abbey had been returned to something like its usual self, the robe was taken off, and folded, and wrapped, and stored. In the world of the British royal family, objects like the coronation robe do not simply sit in someone's home. They are not personal possessions in the way that ordinary people have personal possessions. They belong to something called the Royal Collection, which is the formal name for the vast accumulation of artworks, furniture, jewels, textiles, books, manuscripts, carriages, weapons, photographs, and historical objects that has been gathered by the British monarchy over centuries. The Royal Collection is staggering in its size and its significance. There are over 1 million objects in it. There are paintings by Rembrandt and Vermeer and Holbein and Leonardo da Vinci. There are suits of armor that were actually worn in battle. There are letters written by monarchs going back to the medieval period. There are pieces of furniture that have sat in royal palaces since before America existed as a country. And there are textiles, among them some of the most significant ceremonial garments in the history of the British crown. The coronation robe of Elizabeth II was one of those textiles. After the 1953 ceremony, it was catalogued, given its official reference number, stored in the kind of carefully controlled environment that precious old cloth requires, neither too warm nor too cold, neither too damp nor too dry, kept away from light that could fade the velvet, checked periodically by conservation specialists who knew how to look at fabric and understand what it was telling them about its condition. It was taken out occasionally for exhibitions. It was photographed by historians and fashion scholars and people who wrote serious academic papers about the textile traditions of British coronations. It was studied and admired and treated with the care that something of its significance deserves. But it lived, as far as anyone officially knew, in the royal collection, not in a private wardrobe, not wrapped in someone's muslin in the cedar-scented back corner of a residential closet. That is what made the discovery, when it came, so extraordinary. To understand what happened in the autumn of 2022, you need to understand something about how royal households work, particularly in the immediate aftermath of a monarch's death. When Queen Elizabeth II died on the 8th of September 2022 at Balmoral Castle in the Scottish Highlands, she was 96 years old, and she had been the Queen for 70 years. Her death was not entirely unexpected, in the way that the deaths of very old people who have been gradually declining are not entirely unexpected, and yet the shock of it, when it came, was still real and still sharp. The nation went into a period of official mourning. The flag at Buckingham Palace was lowered. People left flowers outside the gates of royal residences. The BBC changed its schedules. Parliament was suspended. The world paused. In the days that followed, the queue of people who wanted to pay their respects to the Queen as she lay in state at Westminster Hall stretched for miles. People stood in it for hours, sometimes overnight, in the autumn cold, to walk for a few seconds past a coffin draped in the royal standard. Nobody made them do this. Nobody was surprised that they wanted to. She had been the Queen for 70 years. She had been the Queen for the entire lifetime of most people alive in Britain. The idea of a Britain without her, as its Queen, was something that most people had known was coming for years, and that still felt, when it arrived, genuinely hard to absorb. And behind all of that public grief, the machinery of the crown began to do what it has always done in such moments. It started the process of transition. Charles became king the moment his mother died, not at a ceremony, not at a formal announcement, but at the actual moment of her death. This is how monarchy works. The transition is instantaneous, And with that instantaneous transition came a cascade of practical things that needed to happen. He and Camilla needed to move from Clarence House, which had been their London home for nearly 2 decades, to Buckingham Palace, the official London residence of the monarch. This was not a matter of preference. It was protocol. The monarch lives at Buckingham Palace. The new monarch and his queen consort needed to be there. And before you can fully vacate a royal residence, before it can be repurposed or opened to staff of a different tenant or otherwise moved on from, there needs to be an inventory, a complete, official, documented record of everything in the building. Every piece of furniture, every piece of art on the walls, every object in every cabinet and every closet and every drawer, every garment in every wardrobe. This is not a task undertaken lightly, and it is not a task given to people who are not qualified for it. The inventory team that was assembled for Clarence House in the autumn of 2022 was a small group of experienced professionals. There was a senior guard captain who had spent 3 decades in royal service. There were 2 junior officers who worked with him. And there was a palace archivist who had a specialist knowledge of royal garments and textiles, whose job it was to identify and properly categorize anything in the house that fell within her area of expertise. They began their work methodically, room by room, floor by floor, moving through the house with the careful thoroughness that the job demanded. The public rooms were relatively straightforward. The art on the walls was catalogued. The furniture was documented. The objects in display cabinets were photographed and cross-referenced against existing records. Then they moved into the private rooms. The private rooms of Clarence House were different. Anyone who has ever cleared a house after someone has left it will understand the particular feeling of walking into spaces where a life has been lived. There is a quality of presence that rooms retain long after their occupants have gone. Not a supernatural presence, but a human one. The book left face down on a table because someone intended to come back to it. The indentation in a chair cushion that has taken on the shape of the person who sat in it every evening. The smell of cedar and fabric and old wood and faintly, whatever perfume or aftershave the person wore on ordinary days when they were not performing for anyone. Clarence House had that quality. It had been lived in genuinely and personally, in a way that Buckingham Palace, with its vast scale and its relentless official function, perhaps could not be. For Charles and Camilla, it had been a home in the truest sense of the word, a place where they had breakfast together, where they kept the things they actually liked, rather than the things that needed to be on display, where they had simply been 2 people living a life, even if that life happened to be more complicated and more observed than most people's lives are. Charles had developed a deep attachment to Clarence House over the years. He had landscaped parts of the garden himself, in the hands-on way that he tends to approach the things he cares about. He had arranged his private rooms with the accumulated objects of decades, books and paintings and pieces of furniture that meant something to him personally, rather than simply representing the appropriate level of grandeur for a person of his position. It was, in this sense, genuinely his home rather than simply his residence, and there is a difference between those 2 things that matters. Camilla had brought her own personality to her rooms in the house. She was not someone who lived surrounded by formality, even when formality was available to her. She preferred comfort and warmth and the evidence of an actual life being lived, rather than performed. Her rooms had the quality of spaces that a real person used every day, not showcased for visitors. The kind of rooms that are slightly difficult to photograph well because they are organized around living in them rather than being looked at. When the inventory team moved into Camilla's private rooms, which included her dressing room and her personal wardrobe spaces, the archivist took the lead. This was her area. She moved carefully along the hanging rails, one by one, noting what was there: formal gowns for state dinners and official occasions, coats in the particular shades that show up well in daylight and photograph clearly against the backdrop of public buildings, day dresses of the kind that need to work in a wide range of settings, comfortable enough to stand in for hours, formal enough not to look careless, the wardrobe of a woman who had spent many years in public life, and who had learned what worked and what did not. There were also, at the far end of the wardrobe, the things that had been stored for longer periods. The cedar-lined section at the back, which was cooler and darker and had that particular cedar smell that people who know old houses and old wardrobes recognize immediately. Cedar is used in wardrobes for a reason. It keeps moths away. It preserves cloth. It creates an environment that is kind to fabric that needs to last. The archivist moved into this section and began working through what was there. There were garments in protective covers that had clearly not been opened for some time. There were storage boxes on the upper shelves. And at the very back, against the far wall, there were several items that were wrapped in muslin. Muslin is significant. Ordinary people do not generally wrap their clothes in muslin. It is a conservation technique, a way of storing textiles that need to be protected without being sealed. It breathes. It keeps dust off. It is the kind of wrapping that is used when someone knows, or was told, that what they are wrapping matters and needs to be looked after. The archivist reached out and felt the first of these muslin-wrapped items. She was not unwrapping it, just feeling through the cloth to understand its shape and weight. She felt something heavy, something with a particular density that she knew, from years of working with ceremonial textiles, was associated with velvet, with fine, old, well-preserved velvet. She pressed more carefully and felt the softness along one edge that told her it was trimmed with something even softer. Something like fur. She paused. She was a professional. She did not jump to conclusions. She breathed. She looked at the size and shape of the wrapped item again, considered it, and then, very carefully, she began to loosen the muslin at one corner. Not to unwrap it, just to look. The corner came back, and what she saw underneath it made her stop completely, in the way that you stop when your brain receives information that it is not yet sure how to process. The color was unmistakable. You could describe imperial purple to someone 100 times, explain that it is a deep, rich, jewel-like purple that is neither quite blue nor quite red, but sits in a register entirely its own, and they would still not quite understand until they saw it in person. When you see it in person, in a piece of velvet that has been properly preserved and that has not faded, you understand immediately why this color was reserved for royalty. It is not a color that whispers. It does not fade into the background. It asserts itself with a quiet authority that is very hard to ignore. The archivist saw that color. She saw the white of the ermine at the edge. She saw the gleam of gold thread in the embroidery, catching the light from the wardrobe lamp, still bright after all the decades that had passed since those threads were worked by hand into the fabric. She had spent her career working with royal textiles. She had studied the garments of coronations and state occasions. She had read about this robe. She had seen photographs of this robe. She had, on one occasion, seen it in person at an exhibition where she had been working in a professional capacity. She knew exactly what it was. She turned to the guard captain, who was standing behind her with his clipboard and his pen, making his careful methodical notes about what was on which rail, and in which box and in which position. She spoke to him quietly, the kind of quiet you use when you are trying to communicate the significance of something without disrupting the professional atmosphere that a situation requires. He put down his clipboard. He came and looked. They stood there for a moment that felt much longer than it probably was. The wardrobe lamp hummed softly. The cedar smell was very present. Outside, somewhere, there was the distant sound of London going about its business, the way London always does, indifferent to what is happening behind closed doors in the buildings along its streets. Neither of them said anything, because what was in front of them, wrapped in conservation-grade muslin and sitting in the back of Camilla's private wardrobe in Clarence House, was the Coronation Robe of Queen Elizabeth II, the robe from 1953, the one from the photographs, the one that was supposed to be in the royal collection, the one that the whole world had seen on the most significant day in modern British royal history. That robe, this wardrobe, this room. What the guard captain did next is worth describing in some detail, because it tells you something important about the kind of person who ends up in royal service and stays there for 30 years. He did not take out his phone. He did not photograph the robe and send it to someone. He did not text a colleague or call a friend or step outside to compose himself and wonder aloud to anyone within earshot what he had just found. He did not panic, and he did not treat the moment as though it were the beginning of a scandal that needed to be managed. He stood there for the appropriate amount of time to be sure he understood what he was looking at. Then he covered the robe back up, very carefully, the way it had been. He asked the junior officers who were working in the adjacent part of the room to step out for a few minutes, framing it as something routine, a need to check something, nothing to concern themselves about. He waited until they had gone, and then he made a note in his official log. The note was dry and precise, the kind of note that reveals nothing to someone who does not already know what they are reading, but that records exactly what was found, where, and when. This is the discipline of royal service. You document. You go through proper channels. You do not create a story. You report a fact. The archivist did something similar in her own professional records. She noted the item, its apparent condition, its location, and the fact that its presence here was unexpected and required immediate verification against the Royal Collection Catalogue. The junior officers were told nothing that day. The rest of the inventory continued. The team completed their work in the room, documented everything else that was there, and moved on to the next space. And when the working day was over and they left the building, the guard captain made his phone call to his superior. The archivist made hers. By that evening, the Lord Chamberlain's office knew. The Lord Chamberlain's office is not a department that most people have heard of, but it is one of the most important administrative bodies in the royal household. It is responsible for state ceremonies. It manages the formal occasions that mark the significant moments of the crown. It oversees the protocol that governs how the royal family presents itself to the world, and it has a particular responsibility for the royal collection and for anything that belongs to the crown. When the senior officials in this office were informed of what had been found in Clarence House, they did what such officials do. They convened, quietly, in the way that all significant conversations in royal service are quiet. They reviewed the royal collection records. They confirmed that the Coronation Robe of 1953 was indeed catalogued as part of the collection. They noted that there was no documented authorization for it to be located anywhere other than its designated storage. And then they began to ask the questions. How had it gotten there? When had it arrived? Had it been there for a long time or moved recently? Was there an administrative error somewhere in the chain of custody? Had it been taken without anyone realizing? And the most delicate question of all, the one that nobody wanted to phrase badly, but that everyone in that room was thinking, did Camilla know it was there? These questions required investigation. Not the loud, visible kind of investigation with outside parties and press statements, but the quiet, internal kind that royal institutions are very good at. The kind where a small number of trusted people look very carefully at a very specific set of records and speak very carefully to a very specific number of people, and where everything that is discovered is shared only with those who need to know it. And what that investigation found over the following weeks was not what anyone had expected to find. To understand the full picture of what the investigation uncovered, you need to understand something about the relationship between Queen Elizabeth II and Camilla, because that relationship is at the heart of everything, and it is a relationship that did not begin well. When Prince Charles and Princess Diana married in 1981, it was one of the most watched events in television history. 750 million people watched it around the world. Diana was 20 years old, beautiful, warm, and clearly nervous in the most endearing possible way. The dress she wore became one of the most famous wedding dresses ever made. The whole thing had the quality of a fairy tale, and the world, that summer, wanted very much to believe in fairy tales. Camilla was not part of that fairy tale. She and Charles had known each other since the early 1970s, before his marriage to Diana, and their connection had never entirely ended. As the years of the marriage passed, and it became clear that the fairy tale was not what it had appeared to be, the situation became extraordinarily complicated. And when it became public, it became one of the most scrutinized and publicly argued about situations in royal history. Diana died in August 1997, in Paris, and with her death came a fresh wave of public emotion and a fresh focusing of attention on Camilla. For many people, Camilla was the villain of the story. She had been the other woman in a marriage that the public had loved, and now the woman the public had loved was dead. The feelings directed at Camilla were not gentle. The Queen, during all of this, did what the Queen did in complicated situations. She watched. She waited. She said very little publicly about any of it. She maintained the distance from personal controversy that she had always maintained, not because she did not have opinions, she very much did, but because she understood that the monarch cannot afford to be pulled into the kind of emotional public argument that this situation had become. It would have damaged the crown, and she had spent her entire life protecting the crown. But she was watching Camilla. What she was watching for was simple, in principle, even if it was not simple in practice. She was watching to see whether Camilla would endure, whether she would manage the public hostility without making it worse, whether she would find a way to do what needed to be done in the particular position she occupied, which was a position of extraordinary visibility combined with a complete absence of any official standing that would have given her the authority to simply get on with things. Camilla was not a princess. She was not a duchess at this point, though she would eventually become one. She was simply the woman Prince Charles was with, in a world that had very complicated feelings about that fact. She had no title, no official role, no public function. She could not simply step into charity work or public engagements in the way that official members of the royal family could. She existed in a kind of limbo, visible but undefined, part of the family in private, but not in public, and she got on with it. That is really the only way to describe what she did. She did not make dramatic statements. She did not court public sympathy. She did not position herself strategically. She simply showed up, did what was asked of her, behaved impeccably in the settings where she was asked to appear, and did not complain about the rest of it, at least not in any way that ever reached the outside world. In 2005, Charles and Camilla married. It was a civil ceremony, quiet by royal standards, followed by a blessing at St. George's Chapel at Windsor. The Queen attended the blessing but not the civil ceremony, and this was noted by everyone paying attention, because everything the Queen did in those days was noted by everyone paying attention. But she was there. She raised a glass. She made a warm, gently humorous speech that left no doubt about the position she was taking. And over the years that followed, as Camilla settled into life as the Duchess of Cornwall, as she developed her own public charitable work, as she became a steady and professional presence at the events and occasions her role required her to attend, the relationship between her and the Queen quietly changed. Not in any way that was announced or celebrated or marked by any particular public gesture, at least not until near the end. Just a gradual deepening of something, a mutual recognition, the kind that two women develop when they have both spent a long time doing a difficult job in the same institution and have both decided to do it properly. In February 2022, on the occasion of the Platinum Jubilee, Queen Elizabeth II made a statement that surprised many people and was understood by those who knew her to have been a very deliberate and long-considered decision. She said, in writing, that it was her sincere wish that when Charles became king, Camilla would be known as Queen Consort, not a lesser title, not a compromise. Queen Consort, the full designation. People who had watched the relationship between the two women over the years understood what this meant. It was not a political calculation. It was the statement of a woman who had made up her mind about something and who wanted the record to be clear. It was a validation that had been earned over 2 decades of quiet, unglamorous, steadfast work. And it was, those who knew them both would later understand, not the last thing the Queen would do to make sure Camilla knew she had been seen. The investigation into the robe eventually found its way to a particular piece of information that made everything else make sense. In the years before her death, Queen Elizabeth II had made several private visits to Clarence House. This was not unusual. Her relationship with Charles was close, and Camilla had become someone whose company she genuinely sought, not just tolerated. The visits were not always official occasions. Sometimes they were simply family moments, the kind that do not make the schedule of public engagements and do not get written up in the court circular. On one of these visits, the Queen had brought a small trunk with her. One of those old leather and brass trunks that the royal family uses for the kind of things they carry personally. Not the large luggage that gets stacked in vans and driven between residences, but the things you keep close, the things you travel with in the car because you do not want them out of your sight. The household staff at Clarence House had noticed it, but had not inventoried it. It was the Queen's personal luggage. What she chose to bring was entirely her own affair. The trunk had been taken upstairs, and it had not come back down, or rather, not everything that had been inside it had come back down. Among the late Queen's private papers, reviewed in the weeks following her death by her most senior personal secretary, a man who had been in royal service for many years and who was the right person for this particular task, precisely because he was not a person who was shocked by much and who understood, better than almost anyone, the weight of the documents he was responsible for. There was a letter. It was handwritten. This was not surprising, exactly, because the Queen had always been known for writing by hand when something mattered to her. But it was notable because by her final years she had become physically less able than she had been, and handwriting was more effortful than it had once been. The fact that she had chosen to write this by hand rather than dictate it or have it typed told you something about how much she had wanted this particular communication to feel personal. It was addressed to Camilla, not to a title, not to a position, just to Camilla. The private secretary, understanding immediately what he was holding and what needed to happen with it, followed the proper procedure. The letter was documented and secured. Its existence was noted in the relevant records. And then, when the moment was right, it was delivered through the appropriate channels to the person it had been written for. The letter has never been made public. It will almost certainly never be made public, because it was a private communication between two women and because the British royal family does not release private communications of this nature. But people who are aware of its existence have spoken about it in careful terms, in the way that people in royal service sometimes speak about things they know without claiming to know more than they do. And from those careful words, and from what we understand about both women and about their relationship, and from the context of the robe itself, a clear picture emerges. The Queen wrote about time. She was a woman who was facing the end of a very long life, and she was not sentimental about it in the way that people sometimes expect very old, very accomplished people to be sentimental. She was clear-eyed, the way she had always been clear-eyed about things. She wrote about what her life had been, what it had required of her, what it had cost her, and what she had found it worth, in the end. She wrote about being a woman in her particular position, not in abstract terms, not as a feminist statement or a political argument, but in the specific practical terms of what it actually means to be a woman who spends her entire life in public, whose face is on the stamps and the coins, who cannot walk into a room without the room rearranging itself around her, who has never in her adult life had the experience of simply going somewhere without it meaning something. She wrote about what that does to you over time, and about how you learn to carry it. She wrote, "It is understood," about Charles, about how she had watched him over the decades, through his troubles and his periods of public criticism, and through the years when the public had been very harsh about his choices and his character, and about how she had watched him change, or perhaps not change so much as settle into himself, and how much of that settling she attributed to the stability and the constancy of the person beside him. And then she wrote about the robe. She wrote that she had thought about it for a long time, that it had sat in the royal collection, properly cared for, and occasionally displayed, and that it was respected and studied and protected. But she had found herself thinking about it differently in her final years, thinking about what it had been to her, not as an historical object or a cultural symbol, but as a personal experience, what it had felt like to put it on, what it had done to her in that moment. She had been 27 years old in 1953. She had been young and uncertain, and carrying something that no one had asked her whether she wanted to carry. She had not had a choice. The crown came to her because it came to her, because her father died, and because that was how it worked, and because she was who she was. And she had said yes to it, not with great dramatic ceremony in private, but simply by not saying no, by getting dressed and going to the Abbey, and sitting still under the canopy, and allowing the oil to be placed on her head, and the crown to be placed on her head, and by walking out of there as the Queen. The robe, she wrote, had helped her. It had been part of how she had prepared herself for that walk. The weight of it, the seriousness of it, the fact that it had been made for this moment, and for this purpose, and for no other reason. Wearing it had told her, in the wordless way that objects sometimes tell you things that words cannot, that this was real, and that she was ready. She had called it her armor. That was the word people who knew the letter's content used when describing it. Armor. Not decoration, not ceremony, armor. The thing you put on when you know you are going somewhere difficult and you need to feel protected. And she wanted Camilla to have it, not to wear to a ceremony, not to put on display, just to have, to know it was there, because Camilla was now the one who needed to walk out into difficult circumstances and stand up straight and do it anyway, and the Queen wanted her to have something that carried in its threads the proof that a woman had done this before, that it was survivable, that the armor worked. She hoped, the letter said, that the robe might be Camilla's armor too. Camilla was told about the discovery and about the letter in a private conversation with a senior member of the household. She sat and listened. The person speaking to her was careful and thorough, explaining what had been found and how, explaining the content of the letter, explaining what the investigation had concluded. She listened to all of it without interrupting. When it was over, there was a silence that the person present later described as the kind of silence that a room holds when something significant has just been said, and everyone in the room understands that responding immediately would be wrong. Camilla's eyes filled with tears. Not flowing tears, not dramatic weeping, just the eyes filling, the kind of filling that happens when something touches the part of you that is not performing or managing or presenting, the part of you that is simply a person who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and who has just been told, in the most private and the most permanent of ways, that someone who mattered had seen it. She did not let those tears fall. This too says something. Because the not letting them fall was not a suppression of something inauthentic. It was not a mask or a performance or an act of emotional concealment. It was the expression of exactly the kind of person she is. The kind of person who holds herself together even in the private moments, not because she has been told to or because she thinks she should, but because that is simply how she is built. Decades of public scrutiny and private difficulty have that effect on people. They either break you or they make you very steady, and Camilla is very steady. She asked practical questions, the way she always does in situations that require her to hold herself together. She asked about the procedure, about what the royal collection required, about what would happen next. She was gathering the facts of the situation the way you gather the facts when you cannot quite yet afford to fully feel the thing you are feeling. The answers were given to her. Everything would be handled correctly. The robe would be properly documented and designated. All the right procedures would be followed. She thanked the person who had come to tell her, and when that person left, she sat alone for a while. What she thought in that room, by herself, nobody knows. It was private in the most complete sense of the word. But you can make a reasonable guess if you understand her situation, and you understand what the letter had contained, and you understand what it means to spend years carrying a weight that nobody officially acknowledges, and to have that weight, finally and irrevocably, and with no possibility of the acknowledgement being taken back, be recognized by the one person whose recognition mattered most. There is something important to say here about what it meant for this particular woman to receive this particular gift in this particular way. Camilla spent years being one of the most publicly disliked women in Britain. This is not an exaggeration or a dramatization. It is simply what was true. She was written about with a cruelty that was personal and sustained. She was called names in newspapers. She was compared unfavorably to Diana in ways that were designed to wound. She was booed at public appearances. For years, going back to the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, there were people who were quite certain they knew exactly what kind of person she was, and who felt quite entitled to say so as loudly and as publicly as possible. The version of Camilla that existed in the public imagination for a long time was not a person. It was a character in someone else's story, a villain in a narrative that the public had decided they understood completely. The real person, the one who had actually lived through all of that, was considerably more complicated and considerably more human. She had made choices in her life that were difficult to defend in public, and that she did not defend publicly, because she had enough sense to understand that defending them publicly would have made everything worse. She had taken the criticism and the hostility without striking back, because she had enough perspective to understand that striking back was exactly what people in her position cannot do if they want things to eventually be better. She had, in other words, done the work without anyone giving her credit for doing it. And what is the work, exactly, when you are in that position? It is showing up. It is doing what is asked of you with competence and without complaint. It is not giving the people who want to see you fail the satisfaction of watching you fail. It is maintaining the composure and the professionalism that the role requires on the days when doing so costs you something, which, in those early years of public hostility, was most days. It is deciding, in the privacy of your own head, that the opinion of people who do not know you is not the thing that gets to define you, and then actually living by that decision rather than just believing it in theory. That is a harder thing to do than most people who have never been in such a position can fully appreciate. And now, from the other side of death, the one person whose opinion carried more weight in this institution than any other had found a way to give her that credit. Not in a speech, not in a press release, not in any form that the public would see or that could be used as evidence in the ongoing argument about what kind of person Camilla was. In a handwritten letter, left with a robe, found in a wardrobe, by a woman who had been looking for something else entirely. That is a very particular kind of recognition, the kind that is real precisely because it was never meant to be seen by anyone outside the two people it was between. The deliberations about what to do with the robe took several weeks. This was not a simple decision with a straightforward answer. There were rules about the royal collection, and those rules existed for good reasons, and could not simply be ignored, because a situation was emotionally significant. There were legal considerations. There were questions of precedent. There were people whose professional responsibility it was to think carefully about all of these things, and they thought carefully about them. One of the things that required careful consideration was the way the Queen's express wish sat in relation to the formal rules governing Crown property. The law around royal possessions is old and not always simple. Objects that belong to the royal collection are held in trust by the sovereign for the nation. They are not personal property in the way that ordinary people's possessions are personal property. They cannot simply be given away or redirected according to a private preference, even a royal one. There are procedures. There are proper ways to handle transfers and designations and changes in the status of items within the collection. At the same time, the wishes of monarchs carry weight. They always have. The Crown's legal advisors, working carefully through the question, found a path. It was not a dramatic or revolutionary path, but it was a sound one, and it allowed the people responsible for making the decision to do the right thing by both the institution and the individual. But there was also the letter, and there was also the king, who was informed of everything and who was, by all accounts, not inclined to let bureaucratic procedure be the last word on something his mother had clearly intended and had gone to considerable private trouble to arrange. What was eventually decided reflected the particular balancing act that royal institutions are, at their best, quite good at. The robe would remain formally within the royal collection. It would be properly and fully documented, including the extraordinary story of how it had come to be in Clarence House and what the late Queen had intended. This documentation would become part of the historical record, which meant that what had happened would not be erased or covered over, but would be preserved as part of the full history of this remarkable object. And the robe would be placed in a specially prepared cabinet in the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, with a designation that reflected the late Queen's expressed wish, and made it available to Camilla in the personal way that the Queen had intended, while keeping it within the proper care and custody of the royal collection. It was an outcome that honored the institution and the person in equal measure. It found the space between the rules and the humanity that rules are supposed to serve, and in doing so, it gave the robe a third chapter that neither the archivist nor the guard captain nor anyone who had worked on the inventory of Clarence House would have predicted when they arrived at work that Monday morning. People who care about the British royal family sometimes say that they follow it because of the history, the 1,000 years of monarchy, the connection to events and people that shaped the world, the sense of continuity with something ancient and significant. Other people say they follow it because of the drama, the marriages and the divorces and the feuds, and the children who do not follow expectations, and the relationships that the public argues about, as though they have a stake in them. Both of these things are true, and both of them miss something. What they miss is the quiet. The things that happen in the quiet are not the things that make front pages or trend on social media. They are not the things that get turned into documentaries or dramatized in television series. They are the things that happen in private rooms between people who have decided to trust each other. The conversations that are not recorded, the letters that are not released, the gestures that are made precisely because they are not going to be seen. And it is in the quiet, always, where the most real things happen, because the quiet is where people cannot perform, where they cannot manage the image, where they have to simply be what they are and say what they mean and hope that the person on the other end of the conversation, or the letter, or the gesture, understands. The discovery of the robe is, in one sense, a very small story. No one was hurt. Nothing scandalous was revealed. There was no crime and no betrayal and no revelation that changed anyone's understanding of public events. An object was found in an unexpected place, an explanation was found for why it was there, and a decision was made about what to do with it. But in another sense, it is a story about everything that matters most in a long human life. About how we choose to treat each other when no one is watching, about what we decide to say to the people who will come after us, about the objects we hold on to, and the meaning we attach to them, and the way we try, sometimes, to pass that meaning on. Queen Elizabeth II ruled for 70 years. She attended thousands of ceremonies and gave hundreds of speeches and sat for hundreds of official portraits and shook what is estimated to be several 100,000 hands during her time as monarch. She was photographed more than almost any human being who has ever lived. There are images of her from every decade of her adult life, from the uncertain young woman at her coronation to the elderly figure she became, always composed, always appropriate, always the queen. And yet the thing she did in her final years that perhaps most clearly reveals her character is not in any of those photographs. It is in a handwritten letter, and in a robe wrapped in muslin, and in a trunk brought quietly to a private house, and in a cedar-lined wardrobe where no one was expected to look. That is who she was, in the end. Not just the face on the stamps and the coins, not just the figure in the carriage and the photographs and the state portraits. A woman who had a very long memory and a very clear sense of what mattered, who found a way, right at the end of everything, to say something private and true to someone who needed to hear it. The guard captain, in the months that followed the discovery, went back to his regular duties. He completed the inventory of Clarence House. He submitted his reports through the appropriate channels. He moved on to other assignments, other buildings, other lists. He did not discuss what he had found with anyone who did not need to know about it. This is what it means to be good at this particular job. Not that you are indifferent to what you encounter, but that you understand the difference between what you carry privately and what you share. He had been part of something significant. He knew that, and he carried it the way professionals carry the significant things they encounter in the course of their work, quietly, without turning it into a story about himself. He was the kind of man, in other words, that the royal household produces generation after generation. Men and women who have decided that their job is to serve, and that service means putting the institution and the people in it above the very human desire to be interesting, to be the person who tells a remarkable story at a dinner party. He had a remarkable story. He would not tell it at dinner parties. That was the deal he had made, implicitly, when he chose this career, and it was a deal he had no intention of breaking. The archivist returned to her work with the royal collection. She would go on to work with many more objects over the course of her career, and she was good at her work in the way that people are good at things they have genuinely devoted themselves to. But the robe would stay with her, not in a way that interfered with anything or made any of the rest of it less important, just as a fixed point of reference. A reminder that the objects she worked with were not merely objects, that they held things, that they were witnesses. She had, in her professional life, worked with objects that had been present at great public moments, garments worn at state occasions, items used in ceremonies. The kinds of things that sit behind glass in museums, and that tourists file past, and that schoolchildren are brought to see on educational trips. She understood the significance of such objects as well as anyone. But the robe was different, because the robe had not only been present at a great public moment, it had also been part of a private one. It had sat in a wardrobe in a private home, known about by one person, placed there by another, held in the quiet and the cedar smell as a form of communication between two women who had arrived at an understanding that took many years to reach. That double life, the public one from 1953 and the private one from sometime in the Queen's final years, made it different from everything else she had ever professionally handled. Camilla continued to do what Camilla does, which is to show up and do the work and not make a performance of doing it. She appeared at events. She carried out her duties. She developed her charitable interests and her public presence in the particular way she has always developed them, steadily and without drama. She did not mention the robe. She did not give interviews about the letter. She did not reference any of it in any public way, because that is not how she operates, and because some things belong only to the people they belong to. But those who know the situation know that somewhere in the private apartments of Buckingham Palace, in a cabinet that was prepared with care, there is a robe, imperial purple velvet with ermine trim and gold embroidery, the robe from the photographs, the robe from 1953, the robe that was worn by a 27-year-old woman on the most significant day of her long and extraordinary life. And they know that the woman who lives in those apartments knows it is there. There is a last thing worth saying, and it is perhaps the simplest. We spend a lot of time, when we think about royal families, and about institutions, and about history, thinking about the official things, the documented things, the things that are on the record and that can be pointed to, and cited, and verified. These are important. They are the skeleton of the story. But the flesh of the story, the part that makes it actually human, is always in the unofficial things, the things that happen between the official moments, the choices that people make when no one is taking notes, the words that get written by hand because the person writing them knows that a handwritten letter means something different from anything else. A queen, in the final years of a 70-year reign, went through the private inventory of her own memories and decided what mattered. She found something she had kept for a long time, something that had been part of a frightening and important moment in her life, something that had helped her, and she found a way, in the quiet and private manner that was entirely characteristic of her, to give it to someone she thought would need it. She did not call a press conference. She did not arrange a ceremony. She did not ask for credit or acknowledgement or thanks. She put a robe in a trunk and brought it to a house and left it there, and she wrote a letter by hand to explain it, and then she went home and kept doing what she had to do, which was being the queen, right up until the very end. That is the whole story. The robe and the wardrobe and the archivist who stood very still, and the guard captain who put down his clipboard, and the letter written in a familiar hand, and the tears that filled someone's eyes and did not fall, and the cabinet prepared with care in a private apartment in a building on a busy London street, where nobody passing by had any idea what was inside. It is a story about armor, about the kind that is not made of metal and does not deflect physical blows, but that is perhaps more necessary than the other kind, the kind you wear inside, the knowledge that someone saw you and believed you could bear it, the understanding that you are not the first person to have stood where you are standing and felt what you are feeling and walked forward anyway. There is something worth thinking about in relation to the way stories like this one tend not to reach the public. We live in an era when the private lives of famous people are more visible, more discussed, more argued about than at any point in history. Every public figure carries a phone and a social media account. Every moment of apparent vulnerability or private difficulty that gets shared becomes, within hours, a topic of public debate. The idea of doing something meaningful without anyone knowing about it seems almost countercultural now, almost strange. And yet there are still people for whom the meaningful things are the private ones, people who understand, deeply and without having to think very hard about it, that the value of a gesture is not in being seen doing it, that the recognition you give someone in private, out of genuine feeling rather than calculated optics, carries a different kind of weight, that a handwritten letter is different from a press statement, not just in form, but in the kind of truth it can contain. Queen Elizabeth II was very much one of those people. She was the most photographed, most observed, most publicly scrutinized person in Britain for 7 decades. There was almost no private moment in her public life. And yet she understood, in a way that perhaps only people who live under that degree of observation can fully understand, the importance of protecting the things that were genuinely private, of maintaining a space inside all that scrutiny where real feelings and real gestures could exist without being turned into content. The robe was part of that protected space. So was the letter. So was the whole quiet arrangement of bringing the trunk to Clarence House and leaving it there. None of it was designed to be found until the right moment. None of it was designed to be a statement or a story or something that would be discussed on the news. It was designed to be a private thing between 2 women who had arrived, over many years and through considerable difficulty, at a genuine mutual understanding. And it was found, as private things sometimes are, by accident. By a professional doing a routine job, following a methodical process, going through a cedar-lined wardrobe at the back of a room in a house that was being inventoried after a transition of the crown. The archivist was not looking for the Coronation Robe of 1953. Thus, she was looking for whatever was there, doing her job, being thorough. And what she found changed the nature of what the inventory produced, in ways that no one had anticipated. That is how discovery often works. Not by looking for the specific thing, but by being attentive to everything. By being present and professional, and willing to stop when your hands tell you something that your expectations would not have predicted. By being the kind of person who pauses before the thing that surprises you, who does not rush past it in order to keep the process moving, but who allows the surprise to settle and be understood before deciding what to do next. The archivist was that kind of person, the guard captain was that kind of person, and the private secretary who found the letter in the Queen's papers was that kind of person. The story that eventually emerged was built from their professionalism as much as from the actions of the 2 women at its center. This is worth remembering because it is easy, in stories like this one, to focus only on the famous people, on the Queen and on Camilla, and on what their relationship meant, and what the robe represented. All of that matters, and it has been the main thread of this story for a reason. But the people who work in royal service, the ones who do their jobs quietly and carefully, and who hold what they know with discretion, and who go home at the end of the day without talking about what they have seen, they are part of the story too. Their professionalism is what allows the private world of the royal family to remain private in the ways that matter. Their reliability is what makes it possible for someone like the Queen to leave something important in a wardrobe and trust that it would eventually be found by the right person and handled in the right way. The robe is still there, wrapped in muslin, held in the right kind of dark. Waiting, perhaps, to be needed, but more than waiting, resting, settled into its place, having completed a journey that no one in 1953 would have predicted when they watched it carried carefully out of Westminster Abbey after the ceremony and given into the custody of the royal collection. A journey from one woman to another, through the long years of a reign and the complicated landscape of a relationship that was never simple, but that arrived, finally and genuinely, at something real. Objects carry meaning. We give them meaning by what we do with them, and how we treat them, and what we decide they are for. The Coronation Robe of 1953 has always been a historically significant object, but it is also now, and perhaps will always be, the object that a queen chose to give to the woman who would come after her. Not because she had to, not because the rules required it, but because she wanted her to know, I saw what this cost you, I understand what it takes. And I think you have what it takes to do it. That is a remarkable thing to say. It is even more remarkable to say it in the way that it was said, through an object rather than words, through a gesture rather than a speech, through a cedar-lined wardrobe in a house in London, rather than any of the official channels that were available to a woman of her position and her authority. Perhaps that is precisely why it meant what it meant, because the official channels are used for things that need to be on the record. The personal channels are used for things that need to be felt. Think about what the Queen understood, at 96, looking back across a 70-year reign and forward into whatever came next. She understood that institutions are held together not only by rules and protocols and official procedures, important as all of those things are. They are held together by the people inside them who are willing to do their jobs with more than just technical competence, who are willing to carry the emotional weight of what the institution represents, who show up, day after day, in circumstances that require a great deal from them, and who do so without complaint and without demanding that anyone notice. She had spent her entire adult life being that person. She had done it because she believed in what the institution stood for. She had done it because she had made a promise, in that abbey in 1953, and she was not a person who broke promises. She had done it because she was, underneath the crown and the ermine and the gold thread, a particular kind of human being, someone with a deep and unshowy sense of duty and a willingness to see things through. And she had found, in her final years, another person of the same kind, someone who showed up, someone who did the work, someone who carried the weight without making a performance of carrying it. The gift of the robe was the Queen's way of saying, "I see you." Not as the public saw Camilla, or as the press wrote about her, or as the people who had decided they understood everything believed they understood, but as she actually was. As the Queen, who had watched her for 20 years and formed her own clear-eyed judgment, understood her to be. That kind of being seen is rare. Most people, in most lives, do not receive it from someone whose seeing of them carries that kind of weight. Most of us are understood, if we are understood at all, by the people closest to us, the people who know us in the ordinary run of daily life, who see us on the good days and the bad ones. That understanding matters enormously. But it is a different thing from being understood by someone who has watched you from a particular angle, in a particular set of circumstances, under a particular kind of pressure, and who has concluded, on the basis of all of that watching, that you are exactly what you appear to be. Queen Elizabeth II concluded that Camilla was exactly what she appeared to be, and she said so in the most queen-like way imaginable, quietly, privately, through an object rather than a speech, in a form that could not be turned into a headline or a talking point or a piece of evidence in any ongoing public debate. In a cedar-lined wardrobe, in a trunk, in muslin, waiting for the right moment to be found. The right moment came, as it turned out, on a Monday morning in the autumn of 2022, when a palace archivist moved into the back section of a private wardrobe and felt, through the cloth, the weight and texture of something she recognized. When she paused, when she looked, when she stood very still and understood what she was looking at, and when she turned, quietly and professionally, to the man standing behind her with his clipboard. That was when the Queen's last gift was found. Not with ceremony, not with an audience, not in the way that royal things are usually found and noted and recorded, just with two people standing in a cedar-smelling room, very quietly, understanding something that the world outside the window was still entirely unaware of. That is the whole story.